Sir, this isn't your seat. The words cut through the pre-boarding calm like a sudden gust of wind, sharp and undeniable. Marcus Carter paused, his hand still on the handle of the overhead bin as the first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. Dressed in simple dark jeans, a black tee, and polished sneakers, he looked around at the plush seats, the muted gold accents, the soft hum of air conditioning. No entourage, no briefcase with designer labels, no flashy watch. Just a man moving with purpose and quiet confidence. Nicole Harris, the flight attendant, stood rigid, her eyes scanning him like a challenge, lips pressed thin, clipboard clutched to her chest. "You must have the wrong cabin," she said again, her tone clipped, rehearsed, as if the repetition would make her claim real. Marcus smiled faintly, only a tilt of the corner of his mouth, and held out his boarding pass. She glanced down, barely registering it, shaking her head. Passengers nearby shifted, some curious, others whispering, caught in a tension that felt electric, thick enough to taste. "Economy, sir. That's where you belong," she added, gesturing vaguely to the back. Marcus' eyes swept the cabin, noting the subtle glances, the suppressed smirks, the way the wealthy travelers murmured to each other, some frowning, some chuckling, some curious. He sank into seat 2A, the fabric soft beneath his hand, the leather cool under his back, and folded his arms, an anchor amidst a sudden storm. Nicole turned to call for support, a quiet exchange of gestures with another crew member, their body language rigid, defensive. Marcus leaned back slightly, calm and deliberate, the silence he maintained amplifying the uncertainty around him. He recalled the times in his past, being underestimated, being judged on appearance rather than merit, a young man turned away from opportunities because others couldn't see beyond the surface. That memory, sharp and precise, tempered his patience, steeled his resolve. Around him, phones subtly came out, passengers raising cameras under tables, capturing the scene, the tension, unaware yet of the revelation to come. A young woman in row 3 whispered to her companion, "Is this really happening?" Her eyes wide, a mixture of disbelief and intrigue, as the cabin's social hierarchy wobbled under the weight of the challenge. Marcus' hands rested lightly on his knees, a measured breath, eyes scanning, reading each expression, each subtle movement. The ambient noise, the hum of engines, the rustle of newspapers, the soft click of overhead compartments, faded under the weight of anticipation. A subtle signal, a barely perceptible tap on his AirPods, a flicker in his gaze, and the quiet countdown of power began. Every whispered conversation, every sideways glance, every stifled laugh would meet its reckoning. The cabin seemed suspended in the moment, passengers leaning in, crew members hesitating, a narrative unfolding silently in real time. Marcus Carter, unassuming yet commanding, remained the calm at the eye of a storm no one else realized had already begun. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, soft clicks of phones recording every subtle movement, every glance, every tension-filled breath. Marcus Carter remained seated, a steady presence amid a swirl of whispered conjectures and the occasional sharp intake of air from curious passengers. Nicole Harris and Brian Foster exchanged a brief glance, their brows furrowed, as they approached him once more, attempting to assert authority. "Sir, you need to vacate the seat," Nicole said again, her voice sharper this time, the words echoing off the overhead compartments. Marcus did not respond, only lifted his gaze, eyes meeting hers with calm scrutiny, an unspoken message that this would not be a contest of volume or force. He placed his hands lightly on the armrests, posture poised, yet unyielding. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the soft hum of engines and the faint rustle of magazines fading into the tension that now gripped the air. A passenger in the front row whispered to her neighbor, "Is he really staying there? Is this allowed?" And the reply came as a quiet murmur, a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Marcus felt the weight of every stare, every judgment cast upon him, and allowed it to settle, not as pressure, but as fuel for what was about to unfold. He remembered the countless times in his early career when appearances had decided the outcomes before merit ever had a chance, when doors had closed for reasons that made no sense, when assumptions had built invisible walls higher than any ceiling. Those memories were vivid, each one sharpening his resolve, reminding him that patience, strategy, and composure often carried more power than anger ever could. In a subtle movement, he tapped lightly on his AirPods, a signal to his assistant waiting on the ground, a quiet command to activate the protocol he had prepared for precisely this type of situation. Nicole's lips pressed tighter, Brian's smirk faltered, and the tension escalated as the cabin began to sense a shift. Marcus' eyes moved slowly across the passengers, noting those who had picked up their phones, those who had leaned in, curious, capturing the unfolding scene. He did not flinch, he did not rise, he did not raise his voice. Yet the authority he exuded seemed to bend the room around him, and a subtle ripple of acknowledgment began to pass through the cabin. The young woman in row 3 nudged her companion, whispering, "He is not leaving. This is about to get interesting." Marcus remained silent, allowing the tension to crescendo, allowing the doubt and anticipation to hang in the air like suspended particles, and in that quiet, calculated stillness, the passengers sensed a power that did not need to shout to be recognized. Every crew member now felt it, a slow dawning that their assumptions had underestimated not just a passenger, but a presence that could not be ignored, a mind that had prepared for this precise moment. And as Marcus' gaze swept the cabin one last time, the AirPods tapped again, and he leaned back with a measured calm that suggested patience and control, the quiet before a revelation that none of them would forget. Nicole Harris straightened her posture, clipboard held tightly against her chest, scanning Marcus Carter as if the very seat beneath him were a challenge to her authority. Brian Foster leaned slightly, whispering something under his breath, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, thinking he saw the upper hand. Marcus, unshaken, lifted his gaze, meeting their eyes with steady calm, a quiet assertion of presence that seemed to stretch across the cabin. The passengers began to lean forward subtly, curiosity and tension intertwining, their phones held discreetly under laps, capturing each subtle movement, each exchange of glances. Captain Daniel Pierce stepped closer, voice low but firm, insisting on protocol, warning that failure to comply would require action. Marcus' hands rested lightly on the armrests, fingers relaxed, his posture deliberate and controlled, conveying that he understood the power in restraint. He remembered the long years of proving himself in boardrooms and offices, of waiting for the right moment, of being underestimated repeatedly, and that experience now gave him an unshakable steadiness that no raised voice could disturb. The cabin seemed to hum with anticipation, the usual ambient noises of engines and soft chatter falling away as passengers focused on the unfolding standoff. Nicole shifted, glancing at the overhead monitors, then at the row behind her, sensing the crew's certainty beginning to waver. Marcus subtly tapped his AirPods, a signal that would set into motion a protocol he had long prepared for these precise moments of misjudgment and bias. The atmosphere thickened, a soft murmur of understanding passed among the passengers, a recognition that something unseen had already shifted the balance. A young man near the center aisle whispered to his companion, "He is not leaving. Look at him. He knows exactly what he is doing." Marcus' eyes flicked across the cabin, noting the small gestures of passengers aligning with him, the discreet recordings, the shared astonishment. Each crew member now sensed the subtle shift, the realization that their assumptions and the authority they relied upon were being quietly, irrevocably questioned. Marcus' gaze lingered on Nicole for a moment longer, and though his voice remained unspoken, the weight of his presence seemed to fill the cabin, a tangible force that brought an almost imperceptible pause to every action around him. The cabin lights reflected softly off the polished surfaces, the quiet focus of every observer amplifying the tension, and in that suspended moment, Marcus leaned back slightly, a faint smile suggesting confidence and readiness, the promise of a revelation that would soon unfold, drawing every eye toward him, every mind aware that the narrative was no longer controlled by protocol, but by the quiet, undeniable authority he now exuded. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence they had held moments ago beginning to waver under the quiet authority Marcus Carter radiated. Nicole Harris adjusted her clipboard nervously, Brian Foster's smirk faltering as the cabin seemed to grow tighter, charged with an unspoken anticipation. Marcus' gaze swept methodically across the rows, noting the subtle shifts in passengers' posture, the raised phones recording discreetly, capturing every expression, every exchange of tension. His calm, deliberate breathing contrasted sharply with the crew's rising uncertainty, a steady rhythm that seemed to anchor the entire cabin. Captain Daniel Pierce stepped closer, his tone firm, a reminder of regulations and responsibility, yet the words seemed to bounce harmlessly off Marcus' presence. Every passenger, from the front rows to the back, leaned in slightly, drawn to the unfolding dynamics, sensing the imbalance and waiting for resolution. Marcus recalled the countless times he had been underestimated, dismissed for appearances, and each memory sharpened his focus, reinforcing the power in composure and the clarity of timing. He shifted slightly in his seat, not a movement of confrontation, but a controlled gesture that signaled patience and observation. The cabin murmured again, the whispers like a soft tide of awareness building momentum, passengers beginning to recognize that this moment was not about protocol alone, but about perception and truth. A young woman in row 4 whispered, eyes wide, "He is not leaving, and I think everyone is noticing." Marcus' lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, a quiet acknowledgment of the rising anticipation. The subtle tap of his AirPods sent a signal to his assistant, initiating a sequence he had prepared for moments exactly like this, a behind-the-scenes orchestration that would soon shift the balance entirely. The crew shifted again, unease visible in every slight movement, a flicker of doubt passing between them as they realized the assumptions that had guided their actions were now under quiet, unyielding scrutiny. The cabin's ambient noise, soft engine hums, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers, faded as if the air itself had conspired to hold attention on Marcus, the focal point of every expectation, every anticipation. Passengers discreetly adjusted their cameras, capturing what would become a defining moment, their whispers and exchanges echoing a growing sense of collective curiosity. Marcus leaned back slightly, a measured calm in his posture, letting the energy of the cabin circulate around him without fear, without haste, a silent command filling the space, hinting at the revelation soon to unfold. Each glance, each gesture from the crew, each raised phone among the passengers, became part of a rhythm that Marcus controlled invisibly, a silent orchestration that balanced tension, observation, and expectation, the prelude to a moment that would shift every perception, every assumption, and leave an impression no one would forget. A subtle shift rippled through the cabin as passengers began to whisper more audibly, their eyes darting between Marcus Carter and the flight crew, sensing that something beyond the usual protocol was unfolding. Marcus remained seated, posture relaxed, yet every movement deliberate, his presence commanding without a single raised voice. Nicole Harris adjusted her stance, clutching her clipboard, a flicker of uncertainty passing over her features as the first signs of hesitation surfaced among the crew. Brian Foster, who had been confident moments ago, now glanced sideways at the captain, silent questions unspoken yet clearly understood. The hum of the engines and the soft rustle of papers were almost drowned out by the collective focus in the cabin, each passenger attuned to the silent negotiation playing out in front of them. Marcus tapped lightly on his AirPods again, a signal to his assistant, and in that quiet gesture lay the promise of action and revelation. His mind traced back over years of being underestimated, of doors closed by judgments cast on appearances and assumptions, and in that recollection, he found a calm certainty that guided every breath, every glance. Passengers began subtly aligning their attention, some raising phones, not in defiance, but to bear witness, to capture the moment that felt historic even before it fully unfolded. The crew shifted uneasily, their previous certainty now fractured by the weight of an invisible authority that radiated from Marcus, quiet yet absolute. A young woman in row 4 whispered urgently to her companion, "He is not moving. Something is about to happen." Marcus allowed her words to pass, unfazed, knowing that anticipation itself was part of the unfolding strategy. The cabin seemed to slow, every heartbeat measured, every glance calculated, as the collective energy of observers, crew, and passengers converged toward an unspoken climax. Marcus' eyes swept over Nicole one final time, calm, steady, measuring the room, and in that silence, every subtle motion. The leaning forward of a passenger, the adjustment of a phone to record, the slight hesitation of a crew member, became part of a pattern, a rhythm orchestrated without a sound. In the stillness, it became clear that the narrative was no longer being controlled by the crew or by assumptions, but by the quiet, deliberate authority Marcus exuded. And in that precise, controlled calm, the cabin waited, suspended on the edge of recognition and revelation, sensing the moment when patience and composure would transform expectation into undeniable truth. Captain Daniel Pierce took a cautious step back, the words he had prepared to assert authority caught in his throat as the weight of Marcus Carter's calm presence filled the cabin. Nicole Harris shifted uneasily, glancing around at the passengers whose quiet observation had transformed into subtle, expectant attention. Marcus did not speak, yet every fiber of his posture communicated control and purpose, an unspoken command that made the air itself feel measured and taut. The hum of the engines, the faint click of seat belts being adjusted, even the soft rustle of an in-flight magazine seemed muted in comparison to the focus centered on him. Passengers leaned slightly forward, whispering softly, eyes wide, phones discreetly raised to record and capture the tension, sensing that something remarkable was quietly unfolding. Marcus' hands rested on the armrests, relaxed but deliberate, as he recalled the countless moments when assumptions and appearances had shaped outcomes unjustly, each memory reinforcing the importance of patience, observation, and timing. The crew's confidence waned further with every measured breath he took, every subtle glance he offered, their previous certainty eroding in the face of an authority that required no volume to assert itself. A young passenger in the mid-cabin whispered to her companion, "He is completely unshaken." "This is extraordinary," her voice barely audible, yet full of wonder. Marcus allowed the cabin to absorb the stillness, knowing that anticipation itself was a powerful instrument, each quiet second a reminder that control often lies in composure rather than confrontation. His gaze swept across the rows, noting the small gestures of passengers aligning with him, the curiosity in their expressions, the quiet acknowledgment that the situation was no longer governed by routine rules, but by presence and principle. A subtle tap on his AirPods signaled his assistant to proceed, initiating a sequence designed for moments like this, moments when quiet authority could be transformed into undeniable influence. The cabin seemed to stretch and suspend, time elongating as the crew hesitated. Passengers held their collective breath, and the subtle tension intensified, every movement charged with potential and expectation. Marcus leaned back slightly, an almost imperceptible smile hinting at the awareness of his own preparation, the knowledge that the moment was nearing a critical point, a shift that would not be undone by assumption or presumption. Every whisper, every glance, every recorded frame became part of the orchestration, a quiet symphony of awareness and anticipation. In that measured calm, the cabin collectively understood that power did not need to shout, that presence alone could realign perceptions, and that the revelation poised to arrive would change the energy in the room, bending attention, focus, and expectation toward him in a way that no gesture, no command, and no raised voice could achieve. Marcus remained seated, steady, his composure the axis around which the entire cabin now turned, waiting silently as the prelude to the imminent unfolding of authority, truth, and quiet reckoning stretched taut across the rows of passengers and crew alike. The tension in the cabin intensified as Nicole Harris and Brian Foster exchanged anxious glances, realizing that Marcus Carter's calm presence had shifted the dynamic entirely. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, phones discreetly raised, capturing every moment, every subtle expression, as the usual hierarchy of authority seemed to blur and bend around him. Marcus remained seated, composed, his gaze steady, scanning the cabin with quiet precision, reading the uncertainty and hesitation on the crew members' faces. Captain Daniel Pierce attempted to regain control, his voice firm, reiterating rules and protocol, yet the words carried less weight than the calm, measured authority emanating from Marcus. Every gesture Marcus made, subtle and controlled, communicated a confidence that did not require verbal reinforcement, yet every person present felt it, sensing an undercurrent of influence quietly realigning the cabin. He recalled the countless occasions in his career when assumptions and appearances had dictated outcomes unfairly, each memory sharpening his awareness and reinforcing the strength in patience and strategy. The cabin seemed to collectively hold its breath, the ambient hum of engines and quiet shifting of luggage almost irrelevant against the growing anticipation, the tension palpable, stretching between every row and seat. A passenger in the middle section whispered to a companion, "He is not reacting, but everything around him is changing," and others nodded subtly, understanding without words. Marcus tapped his AirPods once more, a signal to his assistant to advance the planned course of action, initiating a response that would quietly but decisively establish clarity and authority. Nicole's confidence faltered further, Brian's earlier smirk disappearing, replaced by subtle unease as the realization settled in that the assumptions they had relied upon no longer applied. The passengers sensed the subtle shift, leaning in, eyes wide, a mixture of awe and curiosity as they observed the unfolding quiet power play. Marcus allowed a brief pause, the stillness extending just long enough for every observer to internalize the change in energy, the anticipation building in a nearly tangible wave. Each glance, each minor adjustment of posture or device in the cabin added to the crescendo of expectation, a silent acknowledgment that the situation was no longer simply routine, but a moment where awareness, presence, and readiness to act had redefined the parameters of control. Marcus' steady composure, the faint, almost imperceptible smile at the corner of his lips, communicated not arrogance, but a measured confidence, the type that commands attention without a single word raised, setting the stage for the eventual reveal and the shift of perception that would soon ripple across the entire cabin. The collective energy of the passengers and crew hung suspended, the anticipation of resolution thick in the air, a prelude to the quiet assertion of authority and undeniable clarity about to unfold. Marcus Carter's thoughts drifted briefly to earlier years, recalling a time when he had been dismissed at a small regional airport, judged not for what he knew but for how he appeared. The sting of those moments now a sharp contrast to the control he wielded in the present. He adjusted slightly in his seat, allowing a subtle shift of posture to convey calm authority, his eyes never leaving Nicole Harris as she hovered uncertainly near the aisle. Passengers had begun to subtly take notice, leaning forward, adjusting phones, some whispering in hushed tones, caught between curiosity and disbelief. Brian Foster fidgeted, his previous confidence replaced by the faintest tremor of hesitation, glancing toward Captain Daniel Pierce for guidance that was not forthcoming. Marcus' breathing was steady, measured, a rhythm that contrasted with the mounting tension around him, each exhale deliberate, each pause a tool in the quiet orchestration of influence. A soft murmur passed through the cabin, the collective awareness building as passengers noticed the subtle changes in the crew's posture, the uncertainty creeping into gestures that had seemed routine only moments before. Marcus tapped lightly on his AirPods, a signal to his assistant that the sequence was beginning, an invisible mechanism prepared for situations precisely like this. His gaze moved deliberately, reading each passenger, noting the alignment of attention, the unspoken recognition that control had shifted, not by voice, not by aggression, but by presence and preparedness. Nicole's lips pressed tightly together, a faint sigh almost inaudible as she looked toward the front, realizing that the authority she had relied upon was no longer absolute. Marcus allowed the silence to stretch, the anticipation building like the slow, steady rise of a tide, every person in the cabin caught in the quiet suspense, each subtle movement, each glance amplified by the focus surrounding him. Passengers adjusted, whispering quietly to each other, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and admiration, sensing that the moment was unfolding into something remarkable. The hum of the engines faded into background noise, nearly drowned out by the weight of observation and expectation. Marcus remained still, calm, his slight, measured movements enough to communicate confidence without the need for words, a silent assertion that conveyed power, control, and a readiness that was both deliberate and compelling. Every element in the cabin, the subtle glances, the raised phones, the hesitant gestures of the crew, combined into a tableau that highlighted the shift in energy, a moment where the balance had quietly tilted, anticipation thick, and the revelation of authority imminent. In that poised stillness, Marcus held the attention of all, his composed presence a quiet but undeniable statement of the power he carried, waiting for the precise moment to transform observation and tension into clarity and action. Marcus Carter's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, a subtle rhythm that seemed to echo through the cabin, drawing the attention of everyone present without a single word. The passengers leaned forward, whispering softly to each other, some pointing discreetly, others adjusting phones to record the silent drama unfolding. Nicole Harris shifted again, her composure fraying, glancing at Brian Foster and then back to Marcus, a flicker of doubt crossing her face as she realized that the certainty she had relied upon was no longer intact. Captain Daniel Pierce cleared his throat, attempting to regain authority, his voice firm but faltering under the weight of the palpable tension. Marcus' eyes scanned the cabin, noting every expression, every movement, understanding how anticipation itself could become a tool of influence. He recalled the many moments in his career when appearances had dictated outcomes, doors closed prematurely, opportunities denied, and each recollection reinforced his understanding that patience, timing, and quiet presence often wielded more power than haste or volume. The cabin seemed to stretch, the hum of the engines fading into near silence as the focus shifted entirely to him. A young woman near the aisle whispered to her companion, "He is not even speaking, and yet everyone is watching." And Marcus allowed the observation to settle, not with pride, but as a recognition of the control embedded in calm authority. The subtle tap of his AirPods signaled to his assistant that the next stage was ready, a quiet command that would activate the precise steps prepared in advance, each calibrated to assert clarity and confirm his presence. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, the collective energy beginning to align with him, an unspoken understanding passing through the cabin that the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Nicole's eyes narrowed slightly. A hesitant step forward quickly retracted as the recognition of Marcus' quiet influence grew. The soft murmurs of conversation, the faint rustle of belongings, the quiet clicks of cameras, all became part of a suspended moment, the air thick with anticipation. Marcus adjusted his posture subtly, a small movement, deliberate and measured, reinforcing his presence without the need for confrontation, and the cabin seemed to respond in kind, every gaze attuned, every whisper heightened. The collective attention, the subtle but undeniable shift in energy, created a tension that felt almost tangible, a prelude to the actions and revelations that would soon define the course of the flight. In that poised stillness, Marcus remained the anchor, the unspoken center around which every observer and participant rotated, a quiet force of presence and authority, each second building toward a turning point that would transform the expectations and assumptions of everyone present. Marcus Carter finally spoke, his voice calm, yet resonant, cutting through the murmurs of the cabin like a measured bell. "I am Marcus Carter, CEO and 25% owner of Horizon Airlines." The words landed softly but firmly, a revelation that seemed to momentarily suspend the air around him. Nicole Harris froze mid-step, the clipboard slipping slightly from her grasp, Brian Foster's smirk fading entirely as disbelief and confusion crossed his face. Passengers collectively shifted in their seats, eyes widening, whispers now filled with awe and recognition, as phones discreetly captured the moment from every angle. Captain Daniel Pierce's tone faltered, authority strained as he processed the sudden change in dynamic, realizing that the usual methods of control no longer applied. Marcus leaned back slightly, hands resting on the armrests, exuding composed certainty, his eyes sweeping the cabin to acknowledge the subtle shift in attention and understanding among those observing. Memories of past injustices, moments when appearances had dictated outcomes, now fused with the present, reinforcing the power in patience, timing, and quiet confidence. The cabin seemed suspended in a delicate balance, every whisper, every subtle adjustment of posture or gesture contributing to the shared awareness that the narrative had shifted, that the assumptions guiding previous actions had been quietly overturned. Marcus tapped lightly on his AirPods, a signal to his assistant that the protocol was engaged, a prepared sequence of verification and authority now moving behind the scenes, unseen yet fully effective. The passengers sensed the significance, leaning slightly forward, murmuring softly, and some nodded subtly to one another, acknowledging the unfolding recognition of truth and authority. Nicole's eyes darted to the overhead monitors, then to the rows of passengers whose focus had subtly realigned, a tangible shift in energy that she could not ignore. Marcus' calm composure, the measured way he carried himself, projected a quiet power that required no shouting, no confrontation, only presence and preparedness. Every subtle movement, the way he adjusted his posture, the brief glance at a recording phone, the faint tilt of his head, was amplified by the tension and expectation that had grown in the cabin. The crew felt the change, their previous certainty eroded, their gestures now hesitant, their words weighed before spoken. Passengers whispered, some nodding in silent agreement, others raising phones just enough to capture evidence of the unfolding authority. Marcus remained seated, still and poised, a quiet anchor in the midst of shifting perceptions, his composed presence turning anticipation into recognition, every second building toward the unfolding of control, clarity, and the transformation of expectation into undeniable understanding. The moment in the cabin shifted palpably as Marcus Carter allowed a subtle pause, letting the weight of his revelation settle fully over every passenger and crew member. Nicole Harris glanced around, her eyes flicking to the rows of silent observers, noticing the discreet nods, the raised phones, the small expressions of recognition spreading quietly among the passengers. Brian Foster adjusted his stance, a faint tension visible in his shoulders, realizing that his previous assumptions had been dismantled without any need for confrontation or loud words. Captain Daniel Pierce opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, the authority he had relied upon feeling less absolute in the presence of Marcus' composed certainty. The passengers began to lean forward slightly, their whispers now a soft chorus of anticipation and acknowledgment, each subtle movement contributing to the growing sense that the narrative had shifted entirely. Marcus' gaze moved deliberately from one row to the next, reading every face, every gesture, noting the alignment of attention and the quiet affirmation building around him. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, relaxed but purposeful, communicating control without demand, a silent orchestration that reshaped the atmosphere with a calm, undeniable presence. The memories of past dismissals and prejudices, of being underestimated, surged briefly in his mind, reinforcing the clarity of his actions and the precision of his timing. Marcus tapped his AirPods again, signaling his assistant to continue the carefully prepared course of action, activating a sequence behind the scenes that was invisible yet fully effective. The cabin held its collective breath, every glance, every whisper, every subtle adjustment of posture contributing to a shared awareness that authority had quietly shifted. Passengers exchanged brief, almost imperceptible glances of understanding, the energy in the cabin now subtly aligning with Marcus, the realization spreading that the usual protocols and assumptions no longer dictated the situation. Nicole's expression reflected the dawning comprehension, a mix of disbelief and reluctant acknowledgment, while Brian's earlier confidence had completely dissipated, replaced by hesitation. Marcus remained poised, calm, a steady anchor in a cabin that had become acutely aware of the power of presence and preparation. Each movement, each glance, each slight gesture seemed amplified by the tension and attention, creating a rhythm of anticipation that enveloped every row. The passengers and crew alike sensed that the unfolding moment was more than a routine interaction. It was a quiet demonstration of authority and strategic patience, a prelude to the next steps that would inevitably confirm the clarity and control Marcus had established. In that stillness, every subtle motion contributed to a shared understanding, the cabin collectively acknowledging that the moment had arrived when observation, recognition, and deliberate action would converge to redefine expectations and solidify the quiet, undeniable influence Marcus wielded from his seat. Marcus Carter's presence in seat 2A had shifted the energy of the cabin completely, every whisper, every glance now filled with a subtle acknowledgment of his authority. Nicole Harris and Brian Foster both hesitated, their attempts to regain composure weakened by the quiet but undeniable command he radiated. Captain Daniel Pierce cleared his throat, trying once more to assert protocol, but his words faltered against the momentum Marcus had quietly built. Passengers leaned forward, cameras discreetly raised, eyes wide with anticipation, as if they collectively sensed that a pivotal moment was unfolding. Marcus' hands rested, lightly on the armrests, the calm in his posture contrasting with the tension swirling around him, each subtle gesture deliberate, conveying control without confrontation. He remembered each moment in his past when he had been underestimated, every opportunity denied due to assumptions based on appearance, and the clarity of patience and timing that had brought him to this precise moment strengthened his resolve. A soft tap on his AirPods activated his assistant, initiating the protocol that would quietly and efficiently verify his identity and authority, a sequence prepared for precisely this kind of moment. The passengers noticed the slight nods, the subtle shift in focus, recognizing that the quietest gestures often carried the most weight. Nicole's lips pressed together, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, while Brian's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a restrained awareness that the dynamic had irrevocably changed. The hum of the engines, the shuffle of passengers, even the subtle click of seat belts all seemed to fade beneath the weight of attention concentrated on Marcus, who remained poised and unshaken, a steady center in a cabin transformed by awareness and anticipation. Whispers passed quietly, passengers sharing brief observations, expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding, and a few nods of subtle affirmation swept across the cabin as phones recorded every detail. Marcus allowed a brief moment of silence, letting the realization permeate, the shift in perception becoming undeniable, a preparation for the inevitable alignment of authority and consequence. Each slight motion, the tilt of his head, the measured adjustment in posture, the calm survey of the room, served as a signal that control had passed to him, not through aggression but through presence, preparation, and the recognition of truth. The cabin's atmosphere was thick with expectancy, every subtle interaction amplified by the shared understanding that the situation was no longer a routine procedure but a turning point, a moment where perception, awareness, and authority intersected to redefine the roles and assumptions of every individual present. Marcus remained still, composed, his quiet confidence filling the space, a prelude to the forthcoming revelation that would solidify the transformation of expectation into action and align every observer and participant with the undeniable truth of his presence and power. The cabin fell into a charged silence as Marcus Carter tapped his AirPods one final time, a quiet signal that activated the sequence he had long prepared. Almost immediately, screens flickered across the cabin, notifications confirming his identity, his stake in Horizon Airlines, and his authority over operations that included the very crew who had challenged him moments ago. Nicole Harris froze, eyes widening as the realization of her mistake fully registered, and Brian Foster glanced at the captain, whose expression mirrored a mix of astonishment and reluctant acknowledgment. Passengers leaned in, whispering excitedly, phones now discreetly recording the unfolding confirmation, their curiosity and disbelief transforming into admiration and awe. Marcus allowed a faint, controlled smile, observing how the subtle shift of awareness rippled through the cabin, a wave of recognition that reinforced the power he held through presence, preparation, and precise action. The crew, once confident, now hesitated with every gesture, each movement measured, as the authority that Marcus embodied became undeniable. He reflected briefly on the many years of being underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked, each moment sharpening his understanding that timing, patience, and strategic calm carried a force far beyond any shouted command. The cabin seemed to hum with a shared realization, the passengers sensing that the narrative had been irrevocably altered, that the balance of perception and control had been silently but completely realigned. Marcus' gaze moved deliberately over each row, noting the subtle acknowledgments, the soft nods, the quiet exclamations of recognition, all forming an unspoken chorus that confirmed his position and authority. Nicole's hands gripped the clipboard tighter for a fleeting moment before releasing, a silent acceptance of the shift in reality, and Brian's shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension of misplaced confidence replaced by understanding. Marcus remained composed, seated yet commanding, a still point in a room alive with recognition, each subtle action reinforcing the quiet dominance of his presence. The soft murmur of passengers, the shuffle of belongings, and the distant hum of engines all became part of a tableau that emphasized his control, his deliberate orchestration, and the clarity of truth manifest in that single moment. A young passenger whispered to another. He did not have to raise his voice, and yet everything changed, and Marcus allowed the observation to pass, acknowledging without words the resonance of quiet authority. Every gesture, every subtle movement of Marcus or the crew, every whispered reaction of the passengers, created a rhythm of acknowledgment and validation that spread from the front to the back of the cabin. In that suspended moment, Marcus Carter held the full attention of everyone present. The culmination of preparation, patience, and presence, leaving the cabin with a quiet but unmistakable understanding that power, when exercised with clarity and control, required no theatrics, no raised voice, only precision, timing, and the undeniable weight of truth.